All right, welcome folks. Welcome people from the lobby. As you've been doing all through the week, please join the live session so you can enjoy the lively chat space and add your questions to the Q&A. And we'll give you just a moment to get in here before we get the session kicked off, because I can see the numbers going up. A little cheers. This is the last ones of the day. We making it. We're getting so close to the end here. So welcome to the last session for the official conference. That isn't to just say we are totally done, because we have an amazing event tomorrow too. So come back again tomorrow. But for the official conference, these are our last amazing presenters. We have 3 presentations. We have 2 5-minute ones and a 15-minute presentation today, and then time for Q&A, and then some brief wrapping up, mostly cheers and thank yous to everybody for being here with us. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. And because mostly we all kind of at the end of things know to put your questions in the Q&A and chat into the chat section. So thank you, everyone. We're going to start with Colleen Foy, who's going to be talking about mock systematic review supports skills development while informing data management services menu.
All right. Thank you so much. All right. Well, good afternoon. I'm Colleen Foy with the Z. Smith Reynolds Library at Wake Forest University. I'm sharing details about a mock review project launched as a means to develop a systematic review service menu. This all started pre-pandemic, but has gained traction in the last year. Prior to COVID, there was an interest among a few of our research librarians to support evidence synthesis project requests. When priorities shifted in 2020, this effort was curtailed. However, starting in 2022, with an increasing number of faculty inquiries regarding systematic reviews and a renewed interest from our team, more structured efforts started being made. So this working group started establishing some momentum with structured training and regular monthly meetings to discuss what a service model could look like at our library. So here's a look at our working group. You'll see our multidisciplinary backgrounds and our titles, mine being a health sciences librarian, Denise is our engineering librarian, Kathy supports history and social sciences, and Hugh, who's actually moved on to different accountabilities as an instruction librarian, but has contributed thus far in at least one major way, which I'll share in just a moment. So how we've arrived at performing our own review is due to training and experience needs. With 3 of our working group members having attended the Evidence Synthesis Institute, the 2.5-day conference hosted by University of Minnesota Libraries, and my having completed the Medical Library Association's Systematic Review Service Specialization, we have over 100 hours of lecture and workshop style training between us. However, the team agreed that actual execution of systematic review steps are not the same as training participation. Specifically, we agreed that our individual systematic searching skills just didn't align with the rigor required for review projects. We're all librarians. We can assist students and faculty with search requirements for projects, but systematic searching and the attempt to capture the entire universe of studies on a particular topic is much different. So there was a little bit of an evolution as to our question development, and this is why I wanted to make sure Hugh's name was still associated with our working group. He had this great idea to ensure our time on this project was well spent on a topic that was important to our library. So we tapped shoulders to gather a list of issues that were important to our library's departments. Simultaneously happening was our Digital Initiatives and Scholarly Communications, or DISC, department's evaluation of staffing needs after 2 full-time data-driven positions became vacant. So it made sense for this to drive our topic to support the development of a new job description in DISC, as well as understand what that new role could require from a training support perspective. So our research question is in the scoping nature is highlighted here. What is the scope of RDS in academic libraries, and how are those services developed, assessed, and maintained? So here's an overview of our timeline. We started meeting well before November, but this is when we were fully on board with conducting this review as a team. Our protocol is available on the OSF and is linked in this document in this session's resources, both PDF and Google Link formats. We're screening titles, abstracts in Covidence now, and we'll move on to full text review, QA, and data extraction over this next academic year. And in summary, I want to add just a few comments about these two final steps regarding reporting and service launch. So for reporting, our intentions are primarily to support a future data librarian in the DIS department, as noted. We'd like to also present our methodology and findings in trainings or immersive sessions like this one. And we can also see this project being a potential article course or more so a book chapter in the future. And lastly, our service launch will come after refining some necessary administrative items like intake and data tracking forms and establishing a uniform reference interview structure. Soft launch for us includes a plan to target just our liaison areas first and then expand as capable. Anecdotally, I've been able to support 2 to 3 systematic review projects in varying degrees along with teaching schedule and unrelated research, but that may not always be the case. So we'll need to carefully consider what we're willing to establish in the beginning. Finally, we're excited about what's to come from this project. So we'd love to receive any questions or feedback. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colleen. This is a really great way of getting experience with doing these projects while benefiting your own library, like a wonderful example. I think what we will do for this session, just because of the timing and the length of our presentations, we'll go ahead and do the 3 presentations and then take questions at the end. But do please put in your questions into the Q&A. So Jennifer, there you are. Jennifer DeBerg will be speaking next on authorship or acknowledgement, a complicated question. Sure is.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I had an issue.
No worries.
I had a strange issue getting into the session. It's all fine, I think, I hope. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about authorship or acknowledgement. I am Jen DeBerg, and I'm a user services librarian at the Hardin Library for the Health Sciences at the University of Iowa Libraries, where I've been for about 15 years now. And I am seeing some great slides at this amazing conference. So I put a couple of images of Iowa City campus on these slides to make them a little bit more interesting. I'm going to go ahead and get in here and move forward and share that I am going to be talking about my opinions from working on reviews for the past 13 years in the health sciences. I've worked at one institution. I also worked in healthcare for about 15 years before that. Now, I don't work primarily on systematic reviews, but I always have several of them going on. I'm the keeper of our form, and I pass that out to our liaisons. We have 6 librarians here working on reviews on a regular basis. I don't necessarily have the same opinion as the librarians on my team. We actually are kind of able to decide on an individual basis whether we want to ask for acknowledgement, co-authorship, or neither. We can do that. We can make those decisions. So what I'm saying today is not necessarily reflective of the entire team, but I'm hoping to kind of stimulate thought and conversation, and also just kind of sharing just things that I wish I would have thought of when I started. It's really my intent here. So I will say that the Medical Library Association released this authorship statement back in 2022, along with 2 Canadian organizations, in an effort to, I think, really give us a tool to be able to point to so that we could, talk with teams about the evidence for co-authorship. And I think this is good as a tool to have. And I also appreciate those who have done the research to establish that there is evidence for this. My concern when I saw this statement for newer information professionals, librarians, was that they might view it as a standard of practice or a kind of a directive, which is really why I talked about this before, I think 2 years ago at a Medical Library Association meeting. And so I can tell you that my default when I'm working with teams is to start with the acknowledgement and move up to authorship. And so that's really kind of my whole point of my talk here. Of course, we look at the ICMJE authorship criteria, as most do, and most of our faculty and researchers are familiar with this. And, there's no real problem when we're thinking about the acquisition and sometimes the design of the work, but where we get into trouble as librarians with feeling like we can be accountable for the entire manuscript in terms of being sure that there's accuracy and integrity and basically everything that's bolded there. And that comes from, I think, working with a lot of teams that are not as communicative as we would like them to be. And it's unfortunate, but it's also somewhat out of our control. We cannot always get our teams to share. Very unfortunately, even if we've reminded them multiple times to do so. There was a great talk yesterday, a lightning talk by Marissa, and I'll put a plug in here right now. She had talked about using the ICMJE as a way to get yourself removed from the author list. And I have done that, as well as I believe one of my colleagues, maybe more, have done that at my institution as well. So, all right. So my opinion is that when you're acknowledged, you still have a pretty significant role in working on the search strategy, and you can support more projects. For me, staying focused on those segments of the reviews where I really feel like my skills are being taken advantage of keeps me from feeling burned out. It keeps me from being able to focus where my skills are, I think, most needed. So generally speaking, I am serving as a co-author probably, I don't know, 5 to 10% of the time that I'm working on projects. And it's been working out pretty well for me. So I wanted to just mention that there is good evidence correlating librarian co-authorship with, better methodology. That can be used to justify continued involvement on review teams when it works out, when there's time, and when you trust the team, like when you know the team, that I think makes more sense. But there is also evidence correlating librarian acknowledgement and other levels of involvement. So for me, having an obligation to grow and strengthen and sustain services is really important, and being able to do more outreach is really something that I want to be able to focus on as well. And I think I'm probably out of time because I see Anna. So
You're good. We have enough time in this one. If you have a last thought you want to.
my last thought would be, yeah, just that being able to do more outreach and being able to take on as many projects with, being as efficient as we can be. We all know AI is, being used more and more with evidence synthesis. And so I definitely want to try to use that as much as possible and as streamlined as we can be. We definitely know here at our institution, there are a lot of teams that would be taking more advantage of our services if we did more outreach. So I'm hoping to be able to do that. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I liked your statement, start with acknowledgement and work towards authorship. I feel like that's also an approach that I take, so I can relate to that one. Okay, we're going to move on now to our last presentation, which is from Steph Hendren and Layla Ledbetter. It's Blossoming Outside Literature, Searching in Systematic Review Services, Assisting Teams with Risk of Bias Assessment.
Hi all, I'm really excited to be talking to you all today, and I know that this is the last session, so thank you all for hanging in here throughout the day and listening to me after so many great presentations. My name is Steph Hendren. I am with Layla. She's going to be covering, kind of playing defense in the chat and answering questions. And we are from the Duke University Medical Center Library and Archives. And today we really wanted to talk about kind of our journey of becoming more familiar with risk of bias as a response to our projects and the types of questions that were coming in through our systematic review service. So my general outline will be talking about that in the beginning, then going over the most common types, or kind of the big questions that we will get from teams, and how we like to kind of answer them, both in terms of the technical answers, but also the workflow. How do we try to manage what we answer or do the work on, and what the teams answer and do the work on? And then in the last section, I wanted to talk about the different resources or tools that are available that can help you or your patrons in potentially knowing what the process is, or even finding tools to assist with their systematic review process. I will do a little bit of a disclaimer here before I jump into this first section, that Layla and I both are in a medical library at an R1 institution that does a lot of systematic reviews. So some of our context or some of our perspectives might differ from the context and the logistics that are happening at your individual libraries and locations. But hopefully the general information, or maybe the tips and tricks that we offer, will still resonate with you. And I also recognize that the ability to assist with risk of bias questions is also going to vary based upon the context, the time, the level of involvement that your team decides to do with these. And all of that variation is okay too. So we started weighing into questions about risk of bias because we found, by and large, from our teams that even if we didn't feel like the methodological experts on risk of bias, our team certainly felt like we were. I still remember a team where I tried to push back and say, this isn't really an area I go into. And they just looked at me and said, well, you touch way more systematic reviews than we have ever touched before. So anything you give us is better than what we've got now. And it was hard to argue with that. And it makes sense too, right? The landscape is so confusing. There are terms like critical appraisal, risk of bias, quality assessment. Now there's certainty of evidence. All of them are often used synonymously or in very confusing manner for teams. And it's really hard to understand what you should and should not be doing in this landscape or at this stage. Because of all of this, and as a part of our service, we do ask for co-authorship, and our official titles at our library are research and education librarians. So Layla and I felt like we did have some obligation to try to answer these questions in some capacity, because we are co-authors. We do ask to see and review the manuscript before it is submitted to ensure that the rest of the stages are in compliance with PRISMA. And so we wanted to at least be able to provide some basic guidance to ensure that the risk of bias was at least being done in an okay manner, understanding that perfection is unattainable. So overall, we felt that it is a value add-on to the SR service or collaboration, certainly not a piece that you have to do in order to be a co-author. Of course, our searches are still our bread and butter, but it is something that we have really seen our teams be grateful that we can help guide them where we can. We do offer some formal education as well before we even meet with teams. I wanted to just touch upon our library guide that we do have for systematic reviews, and we do have a whole tab dedicated to the risk of bias assessment, pointing to things like the methodological guidelines and most common tools that are often used in the health sciences systematic reviews. Additionally, Layla and I did develop a webinar that happens about every other month now, called Systematic Reviews, Quality Assessment, and Data Extraction. This is actually a part 2 from our original webinar, which is kind of a getting started with systematic review overview type webinar. And that webinar happens in between these webinars. So our hope is that people will take the first one, the getting started, and then we'll take this one, or vice versa. Maybe they start with ours, and then we can point them back to the webinar talking about the larger process as a whole. And then finally, we ended up directly asking a question about about the risk of bias on our literature search form. This is our intake form. Any new team who is starting a systematic review has to fill this out. I've heard of other libraries and other presenters during this conference talking about them. And we have a specific question that just says, if you're doing a systematic review, what is your risk of bias tool or tools that you will be using for this project? And it is very telling if you get a team who says not applicable, but they say they're doing a systematic review. Or maybe they mention just one tool, but they say in their inclusion and exclusion criteria that they are including multiple study design types. This helps give us some context before we meet with the team so we can kind of prepare to at least broach that conversation and let them know that risk of bias is something that has to be done for a systematic review and kind of just prime that conversation. So possibly from that form or at the consultation, or even as we go throughout the rest of the journey of the systematic review, we'll get emailed questions from our teams. And I kind of gather them up into 3 thematic questions that we end up answering a lot. So there is a common misconception that critical appraisal and risk of bias are the same, and that's actually not the case. This is something that I talk through with our teams all the time. The big difference is that critical appraisal, which is also a very important aspect of healthcare and research, but that is really about caring about real world applicability, and risk of bias doesn't care about applicability. It's only caring about whether that research was done in a methodologically sound manner. So the big takeaway for something like this is that if you have a tool that is asking about applicability in some shape or form, these are a couple examples from critical appraisal tools, and you can see how they're trying to get down to like, well, but would it be relevant to you? These types of tools should not be used for risk of bias in a systematic review. Certainly helpful in other aspects like evidence-based medicine, just not for systematic reviews. Sometimes team will have a specific tool already picked out, and because they see us as the methodological experts, they will ask us or want our opinion to weigh in and say, is this a good one? Is this okay? And I do a little bit of a balance with them. So I never recommend or specifically state that they should use X, Y, or Z tool. That is up to the team. But I do try to provide a little bit of guidance since they are looking for it. And my typical workflow is that I'll just check by name to see if it's one that I recognize to be a deal breaker. These might be very specific to your individual field. So for me, CASP is a critical appraisal tool that I'm very familiar with, should not be used. GRADE does risk of bias, but it's at an outcome level, not at the individual study level, which is a little bit different. So that shouldn't be used for risk of bias itself, though it can be used for systematic reviews. And STROBE is actually an observational reporting guideline, not a risk of bias tool at all, but teams try to use it for systematic reviews all the time. So if I don't recognize the name or get that gut instinct right away, I'll just check to see what is the intended study design type for that tool. A lot of teams don't recognize that a study or a risk of bias tool is meant to be used just for one study design type typically. There are some tools that can be used for multiple studies. And so I'll just check that for them. And I'll also check against their inclusion and exclusion criteria just to see if they're missing something or if they're covering all their bases. But then at the very end of it, it's up to them if they feel like it's a good one. So I always encourage them to pilot test their tools above everything else. We do ask them as a part of our intake form to have 5 to 10 sample papers before we even start our consultation meeting. And so they can use those to test against the risk of bias tool and just see if it feels like a good fit, if there's confusing or vague language that makes it hard to understand, so on and so forth. Even a step further are the teams who have no idea what risk of bias is or where to get started or what to do. And so sometimes they will just ask, well, what should I do? And in these cases, my often response is go forth and explore with a little bit of guidance. Similarly, I will tell them that you need to find a tool that works for your study type, and I will often give them some resources that I will actually be walking through in just a little bit to help them find those different tools that they can choose from. I will highly encourage that they should always use a tool that has clear instructions. All published risk of bias tools should have instructions about how it was created, why it is intended to be in the way that it is, and how the grading and application to the studies should be working. And again, doing that pilot is going to be invaluable. shifting away from the conversation around our folks, if you are interested in learning more about risk of bias as a process, I do have a couple of educational resources here. My slides are available in the resources, which I know isn't available right now, but it will be available on OSF. The recommendations for assessing risk of bias in systematic reviews of healthcare says that it's healthcare, but it has a lot of really great workflow things to consider that I think are applicable to any study and any field that's doing a systematic review. So it's a really great resource, has some really nice checklists and things like that. Cochrane has a really great guideline, but they unfortunately assume that you are doing a systematic review of randomized control trials. So it's very limited. I instead often go to the National Academies Press and their guidelines because they have a lot more in-depth information that does not assume the type of systematic review that you are using. And then finally, where to find tools. This is another really big question from our researchers and team projects. And I have a couple places. These are not the only places. I know a lot of LibGuides that librarians have created have really great lists too, and I just didn't have room on the slide. Latitudes Network is a really great website that is super easy to search. It has a filterable drop-down list, so you can find a tool by study design type. And so I found it really helpful. The only thing for me is that it only has about 40 tools in it, which isn't a lot if you're trying to find a really niche location. So I'm going to make a very shameless plug for the other link that I have on this slide. I'm also going to drop this into chat directly. This is an Excel spreadsheet that Layla and I have put together and put onto OSF. And I'm actually going to step out of the slideshow and just look at it. So the OSF is where it is located. You can download it, save it to your computer, make edits to it once you've saved it, do all the stuff. It is free to use. And this is what it looks like. We have a number of tools. I think we're up to like 80 or 85. We might even be crossing triple digits soon. And we have the information about the tool name, the tool description, the citation, the original citation that the tool came from, and some different links in the intended study use. And we thought it was so helpful to be able to organize these by the study design type that a team might be looking for, that we have a little drop-down option here. It's a little bit clunky because it's an Excel spreadsheet, but it works. And so you can scroll down, and if you are looking for instance, case series, you can just check the box and hit OK. And it will limit down to the ones that we have listed here. Now, I will say that a lot of these were kind of health sciences focused in mind. So Layla, I'm sorry, I'm going to go rogue and recommend, or please send a call out if you are looking for a study design type for a different field or for a different type of systematic review that is not health sciences, and you wish to have representation on this spreadsheet. Layla and I are still working on this spreadsheet, and we would be happy to do some digging and add more tools to this list. We do update it about every year, so it is an ongoing project.
It's fine. You can go rogue. Please send us your risk of bias tools to put on the spreadsheet.
Yes. All right, and with that, that was the very last of my presentation. Thank you all so much for letting me talk about risk of bias and all of the things that Layla and I have been working on. If you have any questions, or if you would like to follow up with any additional questions after the conference, I have Layla and I's email information on this slide here. Thank you all so much.
Fantastic, and lots of love for that spreadsheet, me included. Thank you very much for your hard work on that. And as long as we're here just to go ahead and go into some of the questions here, we have an anonymous attendee who asked, how do you know when to use a critical appraisal or a risk of bias tool? Does it depend on the research question and or the data to be collected?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So critical appraisal tools are actually something that shouldn't be used in a systematic review altogether, because it is really meant to be used for evidence-based medicine. So for instance, if you're not familiar with evidence-based medicine, that is the idea of the clinician who is standing right next to their patient, or they're going in rounds and they're trying to decide, here's this literature, here's what they've done and the results that they found, but is it actually applicable to my patient in the bedside, or the logistics of what our hospital can do or not do workflow wise, resource wise, things like that. In terms of a systematic review wants to be completely unbiased, and so it does not consider applicability of the intervention and the findings in any capacity. There is a lot of overlap in terms of like critical appraisal will still ask like, did they actually randomize their randomized control trial? Risk of bias will also do that too, but it will not mention anything about applicability. It's just looking for soundness. So in terms of when to use one or the other, always look for a risk of bias tool. And it is hard because there are some risk of bias tools that actually call themselves critical appraisal tools. So the real key indicator is looking for that question. If everything else is related to the soundness, but they don't ask about an applicability question, you're good to go regardless of what that tool is calling itself. That's a great question. And I think it also highlights how challenging figuring this stuff out can be.
I'll hop in and just add a little thing. Really, it has moved away from like numbered, like quality assessment, critical appraisal tools, and we're moving more toward, Cochrane says this and everything, these risk of bias tools, and that's a whole like another 15-minute talk. But you really want to look for a tool if you're looking for something, and this is what I push my teams toward, doesn't always work, is something that scores, low, medium, high, right? Or yes, no, I don't know. Those are a better tool to use than a numbered tool. If you want to learn more about that, come talk to me and stuff.
Yeah, somebody just added into the Q&A quality assessment versus risk of bias. So I think this continues though, like there's so much terminology going on in here. Do you have any like thoughts or insight into all of this terminology confusion in here?
Oh, yes. So, and I think Layla and I actually dove into this because we were also confused. This was one of the things that we first had to figure out before we kind of got our feet underneath us. So, Layla, please correct me if my memory is failing me, but I believe for a while, risk of bias and quality assessment were kind of used synonymously. Critical appraisal was kind of always critical appraisal for evidence-based practice, but I think because of how closely the questions are in relation to one another, folks just kind of started shuffling that into the language vocabulary as well. But in terms of the risk of bias in critical quality assessment, pardon me, there started to be some distinctions over time that assessing quality is actually really difficult because you're starting to get more like kind of fluffy unknowns, which is almost weird to say because you're assessing the risk of bias. You're not actually assessing bias. That's already impossible. But quality assessment is starting to judge other aspects of the process, like I believe publication and other aspects of it that's not actually related to the research and the method that the experiment was conducted in itself. And so over time, the guidelines, and this is something the National Academies Press chapter that I mentioned in the slides actually goes over. So this is, I'm trying to remember what they're saying. So over time, they have ultimately shifted away from that to risk of bias because of those reasons, and to also acknowledge that we are assessing the risk. We're not actually assessing bias itself.
And then before
Great
I
question.
jump back to a question for Jen, Jen DeBerg, before I do that real quick, I want to ask the last new one that came in here, which is, do you address assessment of qualitative evidence?
Yes, so we do have some qualitative assessment tools in our Excel spreadsheet. They are fewer and far between. And in terms of what that means for the final output of the systematic review, it can get a little bit trickier just because by their nature of qualitative, it is not going to have some of that level of rigor in terms, or reduction of bias, I should say, not level of rigor, reduction of bias like randomization and all of those other things that a formal like randomized control trial implements. But you can absolutely assess the risk of bias in qualitative studies as well. And Layla, you might be able to speak more on that because I know Layla is our School of Nursing liaison. And so a lot of her systematic reviews are on qualitative topics sometimes.
There's quite a few survey tools out there. Again, they're not going to ask as hard questions or as pinpointed questions. They just get the researchers thinking about basically how well done or how well documented the study was, what the researchers did to reduce the bias within it. But they're fairly straightforward, questions, just a handful of them. They're not quite, it's not the Cochrane risk of bias tool. So yeah, but there are tools out there for it.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm going to switch over to Jen DeBerg. We have some questions for you. And while I do that stuff, there is a question for the link to the National Academy's guidelines thing. If you are able to find that and throw that into both the Q&A section and the chat, people would love it.
Oh, yes, I will grab that right now.
Thank you so much. Okay, Jen, we have two kind of related ones here. So I think that there is a conversation where people really want to have you dig in a little bit more about this co-authorship piece, its relationship to search design and all of this. And when you aren't the search designer, what happens in there, all that kind of thing. It looks like that's where there's some interest to have you dig in a little bit more.
Yeah, I saw the questions, but I wanted to listen to the presentation, so I just kind of left it go. Really, the differences between the acknowledgement and the authorship in terms of the workload is not that substantial. I'm still developing the search strategy. I'm still contributing to the search term list. I'm still deduping records. I'm still handing off those records. I'm still writing a few sentences for the methods. I'm not acting as a record manager if I'm acknowledged, if I'm acknowledgement versus authorship. I will not be pulling full text for them. I will not be loading PDFs in whatever tool they're using. So really not that much different, but in terms of the time, I can say that, kind of averaging around 20 hours or so for an acknowledgement review, whereas the ones where I'm a co-author, it's higher than that. And that is really where I'm at with this, is that I want to be able to take on as many as I can. And I have run into these problems with teams that are not very communicative. And, in full disclosure, I work with a couple departments that are not great about communicating. So that is a variable too, but there's not really a whole lot different. There's probably, 10 to 15 hours difference though, but that's kind of substantial when you think about it. If you're attending team meetings and things like that, right? When you're taking on that co-author role. But as we all know, these are all variable. And then there was a question about consults, I think too. And I did view Mary Lou's presentation and I thought it was interesting. And I do think that, different things work for different places, and we are all individuals and we have to, we have to make decisions that work for us. We do consults here regularly, and we do work with PhD students who are taking the lead on reviews. Even grad students that are taking the lead, we do have to have faculty involvement when we're doing that, and we like to get the team together ideally. But yeah, we will take them through multiple consults. I will work with people repeatedly. I don't know if the time requirement is really that much different. If I'm working with a PhD student, it still turns out to be very similar in the amount of work that we're doing, usually 15 hours, maybe 20. So hope that helps. Thanks for asking the questions. I have a really hard time with getting it into a 5-minute limit.
No, it's fine. It's great. Thankfully, you are in this session where we have lots of extra time right now. So another question came in. Do you include acknowledgements in your CVs? And if so, how? And or in tenure packets or other things going forward? And if anybody else in this group of speakers has an answer to this, feel free to jump in as well.
I am not including acknowledgement in my CV. We are not tenured here. So that is a luxury for me right now. I don't know how other people are dealing with that. I'd be really curious. I actually have a hard time even tracking it sometimes. So if there's anybody else, I'd love to hear from you.
I'll speak from mine. I'm also not on tenured, though I am faculty and I have a promotions process, and I am not including the acknowledgements at this point. And also have the issue of tracking it. It's a big challenge. And then we have a question from an anonymous attendee. Have you considered uploading your searches to the Search Archive so you can retain intellectual rights to your work? And I think, Jen, this is probably for you as well.
I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. My video, for some reason, it went off. Okay, yeah, I have done that. I've been playing around with Search Archive and absolutely. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it's a great tool. I really, really love it. We've also been kind of talking about putting them in our local IRO, our institutional repository as well, as a way to do that, because as we know, it's hard to access a lot of times, supplements and that sort of thing. So yeah, absolutely. Good question.
And it looks like that wraps up our official questions here. We have a lively conversation going on in the chat around whether or not people pull full text for these projects, which I think is a very interesting and worthwhile conversation for us all to be having. If we don't have any other questions, we're going to move into our wrap up and end for the day. Though I definitely want to thank all the wonderful speakers for this afternoon. Excellent presentations all the way through. Honestly, this entire conference just been an absolute honor and privilege to be a moderator for some of these sessions because they've been amazing.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you, everyone. I think we're really just here to,
We're just here to wrap it up.
yeah, and say similar words. Thank you so much to all of the folks who have participated, who have presented, who have moderated, who have supported the chat, who have done the work leading up to this moment, who are watching the recordings later, and who will engage with us in the future. This is a really exciting community.
And so thank you to everyone who registered early. I keep joking that we did not send out a registration link for a really long time, but somehow 600 people figured out that we had one on the website anyway, and registered, which was amazing and flattering. At that time, the symposium was only 3 days. So 600 of you committed, and now we added an extra day on. So we hope many of you will be able to attend tomorrow for the post-conference event. We'll be talking more about starting and assessing evidence synthesis services. And we have a great lineup of speakers, again, who have been so kind to share their expertise with us. A little bit of a different setting. As we mentioned, we're doing more Zoom meetings with that. So maybe we can actually react in the chat. I hope so. Fingers crossed. But feel free, the Zoom events lobby is going to be live. So you can continue your conversations there. Other than that, I'm always forgetting something.
I'm going to jump in because we've got QA questions coming in for you all.
Oh, sure.
We have a question in the QA from Courtney Hadley. Thank you so much for asking. Question for the organizers. How did you all connect and decide to put this together?
That's a great question. Well, Janessa, I'm having a hard time remembering how we first met, actually.
It was during 2020. I was working on a research project with some of my colleagues when I was at Clemson University, and we were looking at organizational dysfunction and assessing organizational efficacy. And so we had consulted with a few other people, and someone recommended that we talk to you and one of your colleagues at Virginia Tech. We Zoomed, and it just came out. I think you had just accepted your position, or you were new.
Yeah, 2019 is when I got started in this.
Yeah.
Been right around that time.
Right. And I was like, hey, you work in evidence synthesis? Do you want to talk about that?
And then we had a few projects that we had put together. And one of them was a session for medical library associations that we ended up moving onto a virtual setting where we were having evidence synthesis service providers do a panel. And we had 200 some people come to that.
It was another one of those things where we keep underestimating, I guess, the number of folks working in evidence synthesis or who would want to talk about it and talk about our services and how we're not just, conducting methods, but how we are providing services in our organizational capacities. So we had a lot of interest in that one, and we kept talking about how we can let's do something like that again. Let's, keep
And
it
we
going.
realized this is really just turning into a conference or a symposium or something along those lines. And that's when we decided, we started planning for this about, August of last year. And we're so
I
grateful
will
that
say the name Les did not come along until we brought in folks like Anna and Sarah and Donna Modeve and Jackson, who decided to work with us fairly blind. We didn't have a name for this. We didn't have a theme. We forced them into awkwardly brainstorming with us, which turned out really successful. And so that's really how it came around. We didn't start officially planning this event with the team until January. So it's all come about in the last 6 months or so.
very quickly.
Very, very quickly. But it's a conversation we'll all be having for a long time. So I'm glad we can do it together.
Exactly.
And we do have one other question, which is from an anonymous, oh, we have two other questions now. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Where can we find, or will we be able to find that OSF that will have all the documentation and such later?
Well, we have all of your email addresses that you registered with. And so we plan to, after we've got that OSF repository set up, at least for the most part, it might be somewhat living, but we will email you with the email that you registered with, to the email that you registered with, and we'll have that OSF repository accessible.
And I would say, give us a little bit of time. We need to wrap up the Zoom events and take care of that administrative part. And we need to check in with our presenters regarding permissions to chair and gather all that up again. So we'll be working on that, but we will email that out directly. It will not be part of the request for feedback that goes out at the end of this event. It will be separate.
And the last question that we have in here is, will you be back next year?
Dun, dun, dun.
Well, be on the lookout. I think that undoubtedly this community needs to keep meeting. And I think that's the one thing that Janessa and I know for sure. And I think the whole LES committee, and I think everybody here really. We haven't made any formal decisions. We were kind of just trying to see how this would go.
We're going to do the first one first, and then we will take some naps. I'm going to take a little bit of time off of work. And then we'll come back and reassess.
Yeah.
No matter what, I think we'll be back in some capacity, whether we do 4 days or 2 days or a panel or I don't know, we win the lottery and send out invites for a luxury vacation to our 1,000 closest friends.
That's the dream.
Exactly. That's what I'm really hoping for.
Yeah.
I didn't
But
expect
you'll
that.
hear from us, and in the meantime, please don't be a stranger. And we hope to see you tomorrow. I did pull up the Q&A, so I think we're in the clear, unless you're seeing anything else, Anna.
No, but I wanted to have a moment to say a thank you from the LES Planning Committee. It has been a joy and a privilege to work with both of you, and thank you very much for being our fearless leaders in this.
Thank you so much.
Well, we've had a blast too. We'll be back tomorrow. So everyone's not off the hook yet. You don't have to send us compliments yet. We'll see if we make it through one more day.
Agree with that.
It's just 2 hours. We can all do it.
We can do it. I hope our presenters are really excited as well. I'm keeping the vibe alive.
Yeah, I expect an amazing conversation tomorrow. Honestly, I think it's a great set of presenters in there. We had so many people send in such amazing, just different abstraction for so many different proposals. We are super excited to get to hear from a group more that we just couldn't include in the main section, but we are so excited to hear from this next group.
And thank you to everyone who submitted proposals to a brand new thing you had never heard about. I know I had heard from friends who were getting texts like, are these people legit? Is this predatory? We're not predatory. We're just small. But all of the proposals were overwhelming in a wonderful way. And it's really nice to have a dedicated space to talk about our services and to learn from everyone else's.
Oh my God, I've learned so much.
Yeah,
It's such a
IMLS
struggle.
grant would be great.
We have talked about that. That's probably going to be a focus in the next, maybe in a couple of months, just to give us a breather. But
Yeah, I will
Yeah.
say we also wrote down all of your suggestions for swag.
my-
I'm a sticker person. I would love stickers. Maybe like with little zombie searches on them. Working on it.
I love that.
That being said, I think we're going to wrap it up for today. Zombie review stickers, thank you. Coloring pages would be great too. We could send out a little kit of DIY projects. That's more for the to-do list for later. Until then, we will see you again tomorrow.
Yeah, same time, same lobby. And we'll
Lobby chat is forever. I've got to teach, so I do have to run, but enjoy. Third day of less down.
take care, everyone.